In 1893, the first of the Caledonian Railway Class 1s would appear. It was a class of 12 engines, and would be completed by the end of the next year. They were designed by John Lambie, and intended for work on the Lanarkshire and Dumbartonshire Railway, as well as the Glasgow Central, which were both under construction at the time the class was completed. One of these lines had an underground section, making condensing gear necessary. These were small, flexible engines, with a coupled wheelbase of just 9 feet, meant to take turns at a decent speed. They had driving wheels of just 5 feet in diameter, and a boiler pressure of only 150 psi. They had 17-inch cylinders and a tractive effort of 14,730 pounds. The frames were similar to a conventional 440 tender engine at the time, and the boiler and motion designs were similar to conventional Drummond practice. They came with Westinghouse air brakes, and 3 of the engines had steam sanding gear as built. The engines would have been something of a mixed bag. It seems they did their work well enough most of the time, but the condensing gear made water too hot for the injectors to handle. Quick side note, I'm not super sure of all this. I do still think injectors are kind of magical, but I think this might be how they work. They use temperature differences and steam pressure to create a sort of vacuum effect, pulling cold water into the boiler. It's my limited understanding that the hotter the water is, the slower it is to bring in. I don't entirely know why that is, but it seems to be the case. That didn't seem to matter to corporate, though. They kept the condensing gear for a while. It likely helped with the environment in the tunnels. If they had teething troubles, Lambie wouldn't have been able to fix them. He died suddenly in 1895 and was replaced by John Macintosh. Keeping the condensing gear was a mistake, as the tanks often had to be dumped and refilled with cold water. Drivers often refused to use condensing gear, and several were reported and even suspended without pay for this offense. It was said by the drivers that so much time was spent refilling the tanks that often they didn't have the time to eat on the job, so they would be working in hot, cramped conditions while also hungry. The condensing gear was finally beginning to be removed in 1917, while the services these engines were working had already been reduced. At this time, they were pushed off to running works trains, shunting, and station piloting. The first was withdrawn in 1927, having never received an LMS number. Normally when I talk about locomotives that are absorbed into the LMS, it's shortly after they get absorbed that the class is relegated to worse duties, but in this case, the class had already been pushed off to the end-of-life services. You know, menial work, usually. They did very well, as the first to be withdrawn would have been over 30 years old. Withdrawal was slow for this class. Despite their age, the last of the class to go made it into 1938, meaning the class had a total service life of 45 years. Because of the trouble they caused crews, it's hard to call them successes. They were strange, not particularly strong, not particularly fast, hard for their crews to work on for most of their lifespan, and yet they stuck around for a while anyway. The Dean Experiments video is well underway. The script is completed. I just have to start voicing it and editing it. Otherwise, I now have a big healthy list of request videos to work on, which I will be beginning on very soon. If you've got any more ideas, please drop them in the comments. The bigger the list, the better it is to work with.